This is the 11th and final part of Volume 1 of the new and complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Life and Transactions of Joseph Blake, otherwise Blueskin, who is hanged for burglary. This offender, who is a native of London, was sent to school by his parents for the space of 6 years, but he made little progress in learning, having a very early propensity to acts of difhonesty. While at school he made an acquaintance with William Blewett, who afterwards entered into Jonathan Wild's gang, and became one of the most notorious villains of the age. No fooner had Blake left school than he commenced pickpocket, and had been in all the prifons for felons before he was 15 years of age. From this practice he turned ftreet robber, and joined Okey, Levy, and many other villains who acted under the directions of Jonathan Wild. For fome of the robberies they committed they were taken into cuftody, and Blake was admitted and evidence against his companions, who were convicted. In confequence of thefe convictions Blake claimed his liberty, and part of the reward allowed by government. But he was informed by the court that he had no right to either, becaufe he was not a voluntary evidence, fince, fo far from having furrendered, he made an obstinate refiftance, and was much wounded before he was taken, and therefore he muft find fecurity for his good behaviour, or be tranfported. Not being able to give the requifite fecurity, he was lodged in the Wood Street Compter, where he remained a confiderable time, during which Jonathan Wild allowed him 3/. 6d. a week. At length he prevailed on 2 gardeners to be his bail; but the court at the Old Bailey hefitating to take their fecurity, they went before Sir John Fryer, who took their recognizance for Blake's good behaviour for 7 years. A gentleman, who happened to be prefent at Sir John's, asked how long it might be before Blake would appear again at the Old Bailey, to which another gentleman anfwered, 3 feffions, and he happened to be perfectly right in his conjecture. Blake had no fooner obtained his liberty than he was concerned in feveral robberies with Jack Sheppard, and particularly that for which the 2 brothers Brightwell were tried. The footpad robberies and burglaries they committed were very numerous, but the fact for which Blake fuffered was the robbery of Mr. Kneebone, as will appear by the following account. At the Old Bailey feffions in October, 1724, Joseph Blake, otherwife Blueskin, was indicted for breaking and entering the dwelling houfe of William Kneebone, and ftealing 108 yards of woollen cloth, valued at £36, and other goods. The profecutor having fworn that the bars of his cellar window were cut, and that the cellar door, which had been bolted and padlocked, was broken open, he acquainted Jonathan Wild with what had happened, who went to Blake's lodgings with 2 other perfons, but Blake refufing to open the door, it was broke open by Quilt Arnold, one of Wild's men. On this Blake drew a penknife, and fwore he would kill the firft man that entered, in anfwer to which Arnold said, "Then I am the firft man, and Mr. Wild is not far behind. If you don't deliver your penknife immediately, I will chop off your arm." Thereupon the prifoner dropped the knife, and Wild entering, he was taken into cuftody. As the parties were conveying Blake to Newgate, they came by the houfe of the profecutor, on which Wild said to the prifoner, "There's the Ken," and the latter replied, "Say no more of that, Mr. Wild, for I know I am a dead man; but what I fear is that I fhall afterwards be carried to the Surgeon's Hall and anatomized." To which Wild replied, "No, I'll take care to prevent that, for I'll give you a coffin." William Field, who was evidence on the trial, fwore that the robbery was committed by Blake, Sheppard, and himfelf, and the jury brought in a verdict of guilty. As foon as the verdict was given, Blake addreffed the court in the following terms: Quote, "On Wednesday morning laft, Jonathan Wild said to Simon Jacobs, I believe you will not bring 40 pounds this time. I wish Joe, meaning me, was in your case, but I'll do my endeavour to bring you off as a single felon." And then turning to me, he said, "I believe you must die. I'll send you a good book or two, and provide you a coffin, and you shall not be anatomized." Wild was to have been in evidence against this malefactor, but going to visit him in the bail dock, previous to his trial, Blake suddenly drew a clasped penknife, with which he cut Jonathan's throat, which prevented his giving evidence; but as the knife was blunt, the wound, though dangerous, did not prove mortal, and we shall fee that Jonathan was preferved for a different fate. While under fentence of death, Blake did not shew a concern proportioned to his calamitous fituation. When asked if he was advifed to commit the violence on Wild, he faid no, but that a fudden thought entered his mind, or he would have provided a knife with which to have cut off his head at once. On the nearer approach of death he appeared ftill lefs concerned, and it was thought that his mind was chiefly bent on meditating means of efcaping. But feeing no profpect of getting away, he took to drinking, which he continued even to the day of his death, for he was obferved to be intoxicated even while he was under the gallows. He was executed at Tyburn on the 11th of November, 1723. Narrative of the Life, Trial, and Execution of John Sheppard, who was hanged for burglary. The cafe of this malefactor having been more the fubject of public converfation than that of almoft any one who ever underwent the fentence of law, and his adventures being in themfelves very remarkable, we fhall be the more particular in our account of him. John Sheppard was born in Spitalfields in the year 1702. His father, who was a carpenter, bore the character of an honeft man, yet he had another fon named Thomas, who, as well as Jack, turned out a thief. The father dying while the boys were very young, they were left to the care of the mother, who placed Jack at a fchool in Billingsgate Street, where he remained 2 years, and was then put apprentice to a cane maker in Houndsditch. His mafter dying when he had been only a fhort time with him, he was placed with another perfon of the fame trade, but here he was fo ill treated that he remained only a fhort time, when he was taken into the protection of Mr. Kneebone, a woollen draper in the Strand, who had fome knowledge of his father. At length Mr. Kneebone put him apprentice to a carpenter in Wych Street. He behaved with decency in this place for about 4 years, when frequenting the Black Lion alehoufe in Drury Lane, he became acquainted with fome abandoned women, among whom the principal was Elizabeth Lyon, otherwife called Edgeworth Bess, from the town of Edgeworth, where fhe was born. While he continued to work as a carpenter, he often committed robberies in the houfes where he was employed, ftealing tankards, fpoons, and other articles, which he carried to Edgeworth Bess. But not being fufpected of having committed thefe robberies, he at length resolved to commence houfebreaker. Exclufive of Edgeworth Bess, he was acquainted with a woman named Maggot, who perfuaded him to rob the houfe of Mr. Baines, a piece broker in Whitehorfe Yard, and Jack having brought away a piece of fuftian from thence, which he deposited in his trunk, went afterwards at midnight, and taking the bars out of the cellar window, entered, and stole goods and money to the amount of 22 pounds, which he carried to Maggot. As Sheppard did not go home that night, nor the following day, his mafter fufpected that he had made bad connexions, and fearching his trunk found the piece of fuftian that had been stolen. But Sheppard, hearing of this, broke open his mafter's houfe in the night, and carried off the fuftian, left it should be brought in evidence against him. Sheppard's mafter fending intelligence to Mr. Baines of what had happened, the latter looked over his goods, and miffing fuch a piece of fuftian as had been described to him, suspected that Sheppard must have been the robber, and determined to have him taken into cuftody; but Jack, hearing of the affair, went to him and threatened a profecution for fcandal, alleging that he had received the piece of fuftian from his mother, who bought it for him in Spitalfields. The mother, with a view to fcreen her fon, declared that what he had afferted was true, though fhe could not point out the place where fhe had made the purchafe. Though this ftory was not credited, Mr. Baines did not take any farther fteps in the affair. Sheppard's mafter feemed willing to think well of him, and he continued fome time longer in the family; but after affociating himfelf with the worft of company, and frequently ftaying out the whole night, his mafter and he quarrelled, and the headftrong youth totally abfconded in the laft year of his apprenticeship, and became connected with a fet of villains of Jonathan Wild's gang. Jack now worked as a journeyman carpenter, with a view to eafier commiffion of robbery, and being employed to affift in repairing the houfe of a gentleman in Mayfair, he took an opportunity of carrying off a fum of money, a quantity of plate, fome gold rings, and 4 fuits of clothes. Not long after this Edgeworth Befs was apprehended, and lodged in the round houfe of the parifh of St. Giles, where Sheppard went to vifit her, and the beadle refufing to admit him, he knocked him down, broke open the door, and carried her off in triumph, an exploit which acquired him a high degree of credit with the women of abandoned character. In the month of Auguft, 1723, Thomas Sheppard, the brother of Jack, was indicted in the Old Bailey for 2 petty offences, and being convicted was burnt in the hand. Soon after his difcharge, he prevailed on Jack to lend him 40 and to take him as a partner in his robberies. The firft fact they committed in concert was the robbing of a public houfe in Southwark, whence they carried off fome money and wearing apparel; but Jack permitted his brother to reap the whole advantage of this booty. Not long after this, the brothers, in conjunction with Edgeworth Befs, broke open the fhop of Mrs. Cook, a linen draper in Clare Market, and carried off goods to the value of £55, and in lefs than a fortnight afterwards stole fome articles from the houfe of Mr. Phillips in Drury Lane. Tom Sheppard, going to fell fome of the goods stolen at Mrs. Cook's, was apprehended and committed to Newgate, when, in hope of being admitted in evidence, he impeached his brother and Edgeworth Befs, but they were fought for in vain. At length James Sykes, otherwife called Hell and Fury, one of Sheppard's companions, meeting with him in St. Giles, enticed him into a public houfe in hope of receiving a reward for apprehending him, and, while they were drinking, Sykes fent for a conftable, who took Jack into cuftody and carried him before a magiftrate, who later, after a fhort examination, fent him to St. Giles round houfe. But he broke through the roof of that place, and made his efcape in the night. Within a fhort time after this, as Sheppard and an affociate named Benson were crofling Leicester Fields, the latter endeavoured to pick a gentleman's pocket of his watch, but failing in the attempt, the gentleman called out, "A pickpocket!" on which Sheppard was taken, and lodged in St. Anne's round houfe, where he was visited by Edgeworth Befs, who was detained on fufpicion of being one of his accomplices. On the following day they were carried before a magiftrate, and fome perfons appearing who charged them with felonies, they were committed to New Prifon. As they paffed for hufband and wife, they were permitted to lodge together in a room known by the name of Newgate Ward. Sheppard being visited by feveral of his acquaintances, fome of whom furnifhed him with implements to make his efcape, and early in the morning, a few days after his commitment, he filed off his fetters, and having made a hole in the wall, he took an iron bar and a wooden one out of the window; but as the height from which he was to descend was 25 feet, he tied a blanket and a sheet together, and making one of them faft to a bar in the window, Edgeworth Befs firft descended, and Jack followed her. Having reached the yard, they ftill had a wall of 22 feet high to fcale, but climbing up by the locks and bolts of the great gate, they got quite out of the prison, and effected a perfect efcape. Sheppard's fame was greatly celebrated among the lower orders of people by this exploit, and the thieves of St. Giles courted his company. Among the reft was one Charles Grace, a cooper, begged that he would take him as an associate in his robberies, alleging as a reafon for this request that his girl he kept was fo extravagant that he could not fupport her on the profits of his own thefts. Sheppard did not hefitate to make this new connection, but at the fame time faid that he did not admit of a partnership with a view to any advantage to himfelf, but that Grace might reap the profits of their depredations. Sheppard and Grace making an acquaintance with Anthony Lamb, an apprentice to a mathematical inftrument maker near St. Clement's church, it was agreed to rob a gentleman who lodged with Lamb's mafter, and at 2 o'clock in the morning Lamb let in the other villains, who ftole money and effects to a large amount. They left the door open, and Lamb went to bed to prevent fufpicion, but notwithstanding this, his mafter did fufpect him, and having taken him into cuftody, he confeffed the whole affair before a magiftrate, and being committed to Newgate, he was tried, convicted, and received fentence to be tranfported. On the fame day Thomas Sheppard, the brother of Jack, was indicted for breaking open the dwelling houfe of Mary Cook, and ftealing her goods, and being convicted, was fentenced to tranfportation. Jack Sheppard not being in cuftody, he and Blueskin committed a number of daring robberies, and fometimes difpofed of the ftolen goods to William Field. Jack ufed to fay that Field wanted courage to commit robbery, though he was as great a villain as ever exifted. Sheppard feems to have thought that courage confifted in villainy, and if this were the cafe, Field had an undoubted claim to the character of a man of courage. For in October, 1721, he was tried on 4 indictments for felony and burglary, and he was an accomplice in a variety of robberies. He was likewife in evidence against one of his associates on another occasion. Sheppard and Blueskin hired a stable near the Horfe Ferry, Weftminfter, in which they deposited their ftolen goods till they could difpofe of them to the beft advantage, and in this place they put the woollen cloth which was ftolen from Mr. Kneebone. For Sheppard was concerned in this robbery, and at the feffions held at the Old Bailey in Auguft, 1724, he was indicted for feveral offences, and among the reft for breaking and entering the houfe of William Kneebone, and ftealing 108 yards of woollen cloth and other articles, and being capitally convicted, received fentence of death. We muft now go back to obferve that Sheppard and Blueskin, having applied to Field to look at thefe goods, and procure a cuftomer for them, he promised to do fo, nor was he worfe than his word, for in the night he broke open their warehoufe, and ftole the ill-gotten property, and then gave information against them to Jonathan Wild, in confequence of which they were apprehended. On Monday, the 30th of August, 1724, a warrant was fent to Newgate for the execution of Sheppard, with other convicts under fentence of death. It is proper to obferve that in the old gaol of Newgate there was, within the lodge, a hatch with large iron fpikes, which hatch opened into a dark paffage, whence there were a few fteps into the condemned hold. The prifoners being permitted to come down to the hatch to fpeak with their friends, Sheppard, having been fupplied with instruments, took an opportunity of cutting one of the fpikes in fuch a manner that it might be eafily broken off. On the evening of the above mentioned 30th of August, 2 women of Sheppard's acquaintance going to visit him, he broke off the fpike, and thrufting his head and shoulders through the fpace, the women pulled him down, and he effected his efcape, notwithstanding fome of the keepers were at that time drinking at the other end of the lodge. On the day after his efcape, he went to a public houfe in Spitalfields, whence he fent for an old acquaintance, one Page, a butcher in Clare market, and advifed with him how to render his efcape effectual for his future prefervation. After deliberating on the matter, they agreed to go to Warrenden in Northamptonshire, where Page had fome relations, and they had no fooner resolved than they made the journey. But Page's relations treating him with indifference, they returned to London after being abfent only about a week. On the night after their return, as they were walking up Fleet Street together, they faw a watchmaker's fhop open, and only a boy attending. Having palled the fhop, they turned back, and Sheppard, driving his hand through the window, stole 3 watches, with which they made their efcape. Some of Sheppard's old acquaintance informing him that strict fearch was making after him, he and Page retired to Finchley, in hope of laying there concealed till the diligence of the gaol keepers should relax. But the keepers of Newgate, having intelligence of their retreat, took Sheppard into cuftody, and conveyed him to his old lodgings. Such fteps were now taken as it was thought would be effectual to prevent his future efcape. He was put into a ftrong room called the Castle, handcuffed, loaded with a heavy pair of irons, and chained to a staple fixed in the floor. The curiofity of the public having been greatly excited by his former efcape, he was visited by great numbers of people of all ranks, and fcarce any one left him without making him a prefent in money, though he would have more gladly received a file, a hammer, or a chifel. But the utmoft care was taken that none of his vifitors should furnifh him with fuch implements. Notwithstanding this disadvantageous fituation, Sheppard was continually employing his thoughts on the means of another efcape. On the 14th of October the feffions began at the Old Bailey, and the keepers being much engaged in attending the court, he thought they would have little time to visit him, and therefore the prefent juncture would be the moft favourable to carry out his plan into execution. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the following day, one of the keepers carried him his dinner, and having carefully examined his irons, and finding them faft, he left him for the day. Some days before this, Jack had found a fmall nail in the room, with which he could, at pleafure, unlock the padlock that went from the chain to the staple in the floor, and in his own account of the tranfaction he fays that he was frequently about the room, and had feveral times flept on the barracks, when the keepers imagined he had not been out of the chair. The keeper had not left him more than an hour when he began his operations. He firft took off his handcuffs, and then opened the padlock that faftened the chain to the staple. He next, by mere ftrength, twifted asunder a fmall link of the chain between his legs, and then drawing up his fetters as high as he could, he made them faft with his garters. He then attempted to get up the chimney, but had not advanced far before he was ftopped by an iron bar that went acrofs it, on which he descended, and with a piece of broken chain picked out the mortar, and moving a fmall ftone or 2 above 6 feet from the floor, he got out the iron bar, which was 3 feet long and an inch fquare, and proved very ferviceable to him in his future proceedings. He in a fhort time made fuch a breach as to enable him to get into the Red Room over the castle, and here he found a large nail, which he made ufe of in his farther operations. It was 7 years fince the door of this Red Room had been opened, but Sheppard wrenched off the lock in lefs than 7 minutes, and got into the paffage leading to the chapel. In this place he found a door which was bolted on the oppofite fide, but making a hole through the wall, he pufhed the bolt back and opened the door. Arriving at the door of the chapel, he broke off one of the iron fpikes, which, keeping for his farther ufe, he got into the entry between the chapel and the lower leads. The door of this entry was remarkably ftrong, and faftened with a large lock, and night now coming on, Sheppard was obliged to work in the dark, Notwithstanding this difadvantage, he, in a half hour, forced open the box of the lock, and opened the door. But this led to another room ftill more difficult, for it was barred and bolted as well as locked. However, he wrenched the fillet from the main poft of the door, and the box and ftaples came off with it. It was now 8 o'clock, and Sheppard found no farther obftruction to his proceedings, for he had only one other door to open, which being bolted on the infide was opened without difficulty, and he got over the wall to the upper leads. His next confideration was how he fhould defcend with the greateft fafety. Accordingly he found that the moft convenient place for him to alight on would be the turner's houfe adjoining to Newgate; but as it would have been very dangerous to have jumped to fuch a depth, he went back for the blanket with which he ufed to cover himfelf when he flept in the caftle, and endeavoured to faften his ftockings to the blanket to eafe his defcent. But not being able to do fo, he was compelled to ufe the blanket alone, wherefore he made it faft to the wall of Newgate with the fpike he took out of the chapel, and fliding down, dropped on the turner's leads juft as the clock was ftriking 9. It happened that the door of the garret next to the turner's leads was open, on which he ftole foftly down 2 pair of ftairs, and heard fome company talking in a room. His irons clinking, a woman cried, "What noife is that?" And a man anfwered, "Perhaps a dog or a cat." Sheppard, who was exceedingly fatigued, returned to the garret, and lay down for more than 2 hours, after which he crept down once more as far as the room where the company were, when he heard a gentleman taking his leave of the family, and faw the maid light him down the ftairs. As foon as the maid returned, he resolved to venture at all hazards; but in ftealing down the ftairs he ftumbled againft a chamber door, but inftantly recovering himfelf, he got into the ftreet. By this time it was after 12 o'clock, and paffing by the watch houfe of St. Sepulchre, he bid the watchman good morrow, and going up Holborn, he turned down Gray's Inn Lane, and about 2 in the morning got into the fields near Tottenham Court Road, where he took fhelter in a place that had been a cow houfe, and flept foundly about 3 hours. His fetters ftill being on, his legs were greatly bruifed and fwelled, and he dreaded the approach of day light, left he fhould be difcovered. He had now above 40 in his poffeffion, but was afraid to fend to any perfon for affiftance. At 7 in the morning it began to rain hard, and continued to do fo all day, fo that no perfon appeared in the fields, and during this melancholy day he would, to ufe his own expreffion, have given his right hand for a hammer, a chifel, and a punch. Night coming on, and being preffed by hunger, he ventured to a little chandler's fhop in Tottenham Court Road, where he got a fupply of bread, cheefe, fmall beer, and fome other neceffaries, hiding his irons with a long great coat. He asked the woman of the houfe for a hammer, but fhe had no fuch utenfil, on which he retired to the cow houfe, where he flept that night, and remained all the next day. At night he went again to the chandler's fhop, fupplied himfelf with provifions, and returned to his hiding place. At 6 the next morning, which was Sunday, he began to beat the bafils of his fetters with a ftone, in order to bring them to an oval form to flip his heels through. In the afternoon the mafter of the cow houfe, coming thither, and feeing his irons, faid, "For God's fake, what are you?" Sheppard faid he was an unfortunate young fellow, who having had a baftard child fworn to him, and not being able to give fecurity to the parifh for its fupport, he had been fent to Bridewell, from whence he had made his efcape. The man faid if that was all, it did not much fignify, but he did not care how foon he was gone, for he did not like his looks. Soon after he was gone, Sheppard faw a journeyman shoemaker, to whom he told the fame ftory of the baftard child, and offered him 20 if he would procure a fmith's hammer and a punch. The poor man, tempted by the reward, procured them accordingly, and affifted him in getting rid of his irons, which work was completed by 5 o'clock in the evening. When night came on, our adventurer tied a handkerchief round his head, tore his woollen cap in feveral places, and likewife tore his coat and stockings, fo as to have the appearance of a beggar; and in this condition he went to a cellar near Charing Crofs, where he fupped on roafted veal, and liftened to the converfation of the company, all of whom were talking about the efcape of Sheppard. On the Monday he fheltered himfelf at a public houfe of little trade in Rupert ftreet, and converfing with the landlady about Sheppard, he told her that it was impoffible for him to get out of the kingdom, and the keepers would certainly have him again in a few days, on which the woman wifhed that a curfe might fall on thofe who fhould betray him. Remaining in this place till evening, he went into the Haymarket, where a crowd of people were furrounding two ballad fingers, and liftening to a fong made on his adventures and efcape. The next day he hired a garret in Newport Market, and foon afterwards, dreffing himfelf like a porter, he went to Blackfriars, to the houfe of Mr. Appleby, printer of dying fpeeches, and delivered a letter, in which he ridiculed the printer, the ordinary of Newgate, and enclofed the letter for one of the keepers of Newgate. Some nights after this he broke open the fhop of Mr. Rawlins, a pawnbroker in Drury Lane, where he stole a fword, a fuit of wearing apparel, fome fnuff boxes, rings, watches, and other effects to a considerable amount. Determining to make the appearance of a gentleman among his old acquaintance in Drury Lane and Clare Market, he dreffed himfelf in a fuit of black, and a tie wig, wore a ruffled fhirt, a filver hilted fword, a diamond ring, and a gold watch, though he knew that diligent fearch was being made after him at that very time. On the 31st of October he dined with two women in a public houfe in Newgate ftreet, and about 4 in the afternoon they all palled under Newgate in a hackney coach, having firft drawn up the blinds. Going in the evening to a public houfe in Maypole Alley, Clare Market, Sheppard fent for his mother, and treated her with brandy, when the poor woman dropped on her knees, and begged he would immediately quit the kingdom, which he promised to do, but had no intention of keeping his word. Being now grown valiant through an excefs of liquor, he wandered from alehouses to gin fhops in the neighbourhood, till near 12 o'clock at night, when he was apprehended in confequence of the information of an alehoufe boy who knew him. When he was taken into cuftody he was quite fencelefs from the quantity and variety of liquors he had drank, and was conveyed to Newgate in a coach, without being capable of making the leaft refiftance, though he had 2 piftols then in his poffeffion. His fame was now fo much increafed by his exploits, that he was vifited by a great number of people, fome of them of the higheft quality. He endeavoured to divert them with a recital of the particulars of his many robberies in which he had been concerned; and when any nobleman came to fee him, he never failed to beg that they would intercede with the king for a pardon, to which he thought that his fingular dexterity gave him fome pretensions. Having been already convicted, he was carried to the bar of the court of King's Bench on the 10th of November, and the record of his conviction being read, and an affidavit being made that he was the fame John Sheppard mentioned in the record, fentence of death was paffed on him by Mr. Juftice Powis, and a rule of court was made for his execution on the Monday following. He regularly attended the prayers in the chapel, but though he behaved with decency there, he affected mirth before he went thither, and endeavoured to prevent any degree of ferioufness among the prifoners on his return. Even when the day of execution arrived, Sheppard did not appear to have given over all expectations of eluding juftice, for having been furnifhed with a penknife, he put it in his pocket, with a view, when the melancholy procession came oppofite Little Turnftile, to have cut the cord that bound his arms, and throwing himfelf out of the cart among the crowd, to have run through the narrow paffage where the fheriff's officers could not follow on horfeback, and he had no doubt but that he should make his efcape by the affiftance of the mob. It is not impoffible but that this fcheme might have fucceeded, But before Sheppard left the prefs yard, one Watson, an officer, fearching his pockets, found the knife, and was cut with it fo as to occafion a great effufion of blood. Sheppard had yet a farther view to his prefervation, even after execution, for he defired his acquaintance to put him into a warm bed as foon as he fhould be cut down, and try to open a vein which he had been told would reftore him to life. He behaved with great decency at the place of execution, and confeffed the having committed 2 robberies, for which he had been tried and acquitted. He was executed at Tyburn on the 16th of November, 1724, in the 23rd year of age. He died with difficulty, and was much pitied by the furrounding multitude. When he was cut down, his body was delivered to his friends, who carried him to a public houfe in Long Acre, whence he was removed in the evening, and buried in the churchyard of St. Martin's in the Fields. It is aftonishing to think how much Sheppard and his adventures engaged the attention of the public. For a considerable time there was fcarcely a fubject of converfation but himfelf. There were feveral different hiftories of his life, and a variety of prints were worked off, reprefenting his efcapes from the condemned hold, and from the caftle in Newgate; and there were likewife feveral other prints of his perfon, the beft of which was a mezzotinto done from an original painting of Sir James Thornhill, which gave rife to the following ingenious lines: Thornhill, 'tis thine to gild the fame, Though obfcure, and raife the humble name, To make the form elude the grave, And Sheppard from oblivion fave. Though life in vain the wretch implores, And exile on the fartheft fhores, Thy pencil brings a kind reprieve, And bids the dying robber leave. This piece to lateft time fhall ftand, And shew the wonders of thy hand. Thus former mafters grac'd their name, And gave egregious robbers fame. Apelles Alexander drew, Caefar is to Aurelius due, Cromwell in Lilly's work doth fhine, And Sheppard, Thornhill, lives in thine. This is the end of the 11th and final part of the new and complete Newgate Calendar, felections read and chofen by Roy Schreiber.